Cheap, affordable controllers for fighting games have finally arrived, but are they as good as their more expensive, officially licensed counterparts? Here's what you need to know. I'm NihongoGamer. I review a large number of arcade sticks and other controllers like these leverless controllers for fighting games, and the reason I'm making this video is that I have a large number of these cheap leverless controllers in for review, and I don't want to repeat myself over and over again in every single video. So in this video, I'm going to try and make it as quickly and painless as possible to understand what the pros and cons of these cheap leverless controllers are, so that in each review video, we can actually go into the details of each controller and their positives and negatives on their own merits. To make this video as easy to understand as possible, there will be timestamps, so just click on the chapter markers on your app so that you can actually skip ahead to the part that interests you the most. And feel free to come back to this video at any time when you're looking at a review of a leverless controller. Now, there are many pros and cons thanks to this cheap controller revolution, but let's go through the pros first. The first pro of the cheap controller revolution is, of course, the fact that they're cheap. The price of a controller like this is something like $55 depending on which site you purchase it from. Now, if you're new to controllers and you need a point of reference, keep in mind that an officially licensed leverless controller goes from $300 to $400. That means you can buy one officially licensed controller or maybe 7 to 8 of these. And if $50 is still too expensive for you, you can DIY your own controller and then pay as little as you like. Speaking of DIY, that brings us on to the next point, which is accessibility. Now, this point goes along with price basically being a much cheaper controller. It means that you don't have to be rich to buy a fighting game controller. If you've got $50 or if you've got the time to make your own DIY controller, then you can now access fighting games on a controller like this if you don't happen to be able to use a pad controller or if you just don't want to use a pad controller. Lowering the barrier of entry to fighting games to $0 is a big win for everyone involved. In addition to just having cheaper options, we also just have a wider number of options, which increases accessibility. So if you prefer to have a layout where your hands are actually split into two halves rather than having them both right here in the middle, there's a large number of options now available, and that's also thanks to the fact that so many companies are getting involved in making cheap controllers and just a huge number of variants of these controllers. This also increases accessibility because in addition to having a large variety of controllers, they just come out quickly. As soon as you have heard of a new idea or concept in controllers, then it's probably going to exist like in a few weeks. If the FGC agrees that we're allowed to have 30 buttons on our controllers, then you can be sure that by a week or two after that, people will already be selling controllers that have 30 buttons on them. Not only do new designs come out super quickly, but they also get distributed faster. We often have to wait 6 months, maybe a year or 2 years before a controller gets released in other regions. Say it's in America first, and it takes a long time to get to Europe, or it takes a long time to get to Japan. With these cheaper variants, these are often available as soon as you can imagine that they're going to be on sale. You can just do a search and it's like, oh, they're already selling it. So distribution, especially through sites like Amazon, e-commerce, AliExpress, all of these sites, wider distribution seems to be increased much more quickly. The final point about accessibility is that it's now as cheap as a pad controller. Even if you don't own a console, if you wanted the basic way to play a fighting game, you would pick up a pad controller like this official DualSense for PS5. A controller like this costs $70, but obviously you can buy much cheaper controllers for like $50 or $25, and basically getting into the sub $70 range is a big deal when it comes to leverless controllers and arcade sticks, because usually to get a good quality arcade stick, you need the right parts so the controller doesn't shake too much and just fall apart while you're using it. And for those controllers, it was often more than $130 and up in order to get a good quality machine. But one of the best things about leverless controllers is that the construction is incredibly simple. As long as you can hook a button up to a PCB, you can basically make a leverless controller. And that means for the price of a regular pad controller, you can get a device which is as good, if not sometimes better, than their officially licensed counterparts. Now, all of this increased accessibility is in part thanks to open source. The firmware that runs on a lot of these cheap controllers is called GP2040CE. There may be other community edition type firmwares in the future, but for now, thanks to the hard work of the community, it means it's so much easier for anyone who doesn't have the technical know-how to make their own firmware to make a controller. Maybe each person's strength is in different places, like designing a nice looking controller or a wooden controller, or a controller made of metal, or a controller made of plastic. Open source is obviously a pro because of the accessibility aspect, but it also brings us closer to the all PC revolution. Now, whether fighting games will actually go 100% all PC, I don't actually know. Who knows, it could still be 5 or 10 years before that actually happens. But in recent years, there has definitely been a big push towards PC because people are just tired of dealing with the things that happen with consoles. If something goes wrong with a console at a tournament, you really can't do anything about it because the company in charge, they're often sponsoring the tournament and they don't let us change any aspects of the console. With a PC, whoever's running the tournament would have the freedom to change any aspect that they want. They could run any OS that they want. They can run any hardware that they want. They can get any sponsorships that they want. There's so many options that become open when you move to a PC environment. But the main benefit to you and I as consumers is that open source is often cheaper. The community gets to decide where the actual hardware and firmware goes in the future, and we're not limited by rules and regulations set by console makers, and sometimes they don't even agree between one console and another on how things are supposed to work. Another pro that's related to open source is that these controllers can be multi-platform. Now, that doesn't mean that they're officially multi-platform. One of the weird things about controllers is that once they become officially licensed as a PlayStation controller or an Xbox controller, you rarely find a controller that's officially licensed for both. I don't know what the regulations are. I've never made a controller and I've never applied to be officially licensed before, but I'm under the impression that once you make an officially licensed controller for one console, it can't also be officially licensed for another. Or it's possible that it would just make it too expensive and that controller would no longer be able to compete in terms of price. It could also just be regulations regarding like the labels on the buttons. Maybe if you put an X on a button and a triangle, you're not allowed to set it as, a controller for an Xbox, which uses A, B, and X, Y. Who knows what the regulations are. In any case, a lot of these cheap controllers get past that by being multi-platform using a controller bridge. Now, it's an extra inconvenience to have to bring around an officially licensed controller, but there are ways to use a leverless controller with an officially licensed controller to bypass a lot of the issues like the 8-minute time limit. Now, some controllers allow you to plug something like a DualSense or DualShock 4 into the authentication port of their controller, but this is using the GP24 firmware and it does not work with something like a DualSense or DualShock 4. In order for this to be authenticated, you need to buy yourself one of these devices that they sell on sites like Amazon, like a Boots device, which you can plug into the USB port, and then you'll be able to authenticate that way. But it's kind of a gray area why those devices work. So the other way to authenticate a controller like this is to use something called a categorized controller. This is an official PS4 arcade stick, and technically this is a categorized controller. That means even though it's a PS4 controller, it has special permission to work on PS5 games. So an officially licensed controller like this could be plugged into a controller like this in order to be authenticated, and if you don't do this, the controller will time out after 8 minutes. So if you're in the middle of a match, the controller will literally just stop working because every minute it's searching for an authentication device, and if it doesn't find one after 8 minutes, it will just disconnect. In addition to being a little bit nerve-wracking when you're playing in a tournament and worrying about whether your device is going to be properly authenticated with the console, if you're doing it with an officially licensed controller, you're going to be carrying a massive arcade stick in addition to this tiny controller, and then it's like, why do you have a tiny controller to start with? Then again, if you're playing on an arcade stick for most of the other games and you're only using Leverless for a few, then maybe this combination makes sense. The final pro I want to mention today is that being primarily PC-based and promoting the PC revolution brings so many other benefits to buying controllers, playing fighting games in general. Although these controllers themselves get cheaper, the other benefit is that you can run on any PC that you want. So you don't have to worry about buying the PS4 version of the game or the PS5 version of the game, or whether the company is even allowing crossplay between the two versions of the game. You don't even need to worry about the cost of the console. Sometimes a console is at a set price. It's like $500 or $700. There are no other options. Being PC-based means that you can run on any PC that you want. So if you want to run your game at a super low pixel count so that it's fast enough to run on your ultra potato PC, which costs you, I don't know, $100 to cobble together, that is a possibility. And as long as you're not slowing down the network because of the slowness of your PC, I'm 100% okay with that. So the cheap controller revolution sounds like a good thing overall, but wait, there are some cons that you need to consider before you go down the road of buying one as your main controller. The first con might not actually be a con, but sometimes these controllers are not actually cheap. Just because they're running on open source firmware and cheap parts, and maybe they're being mass produced really quickly, it doesn't always mean they're going to be cheap. A lot of companies are just using this open source software so that they can increase their profit margin. They can sell you basically a much cheaper controller at a price that they think is going to be paid because everyone is used to paying $300 to $400 for a leverless controller. But the truth is, it is now possible to make these controllers very cheaply, and hopefully manufacturers are going to pass those savings on to you. But they won't always, so keep that in mind. The next con, and again, this might not really be a con, but the massive influx of cheap controllers does affect the industry as a whole. At the end of the last generation of fighting games and coming into the current generation with games like Street Fighter 6, we saw a huge number of people making controllers from their bedrooms, starting small businesses so they can produce controllers on a larger scale, making innovative controllers, cool-looking controllers, controllers with completely wacky designs. It's been awesome, but the cost has always been high because they're doing it as a small operation. It's often a family-run business, and the economies of scale mean that they can't really afford to sell them at a super low price. Enter these new ultra cheap controllers, which means that everyone has access to a much cheaper controller, but fewer people are going to be buying those expensive controllers. Now, it's not the consumer or the community's responsibility to make sure that people can continue doing their small businesses or making controllers from their bedrooms, but what you should know is that because there are so many of these cheap controllers out there now, if there are fewer people buying the expensive controllers, then you can imagine of people who were making controllers individually or as small businesses or as a family business, they may have to shut down and not be able to offer that option at all just because the new price range that people are expecting to pay for a controller just doesn't support the economy of scale for them. So yes, cheaper controllers for everyone. It's a good thing, but what did we give up in exchange? Something to consider. And this brings me on to a topic that I don't have time for today, but it's the fact that the FGC loves the fact that it's grassroots. A lot of the best aspects of the FGC is that it was sort of homegrown by people who were just really passionate and wanted the scene to continue to grow. But as the scene continues to grow, it does attract money from bigger companies, esports, and all sorts of things that want to be involved in fighting games, but they also want control of it. And once they're in and they have control, it's a little bit difficult to get that control back. So once cheap controllers are here and they're here to stay, it may be very difficult to bring back that scene where we had people making a huge number of really interesting controllers from their bedrooms as small family businesses. Now, don't get me wrong, having cheap controllers does increase accessibility to a larger number of people, but once you've driven price and quality standards down, it's going to take a little while for the scene to reach a new equilibrium where we can still have a balance of cheap controllers for everyone, but also really interesting controllers by small businesses and family-run businesses. We want the fighting game scene to expand, but of course, not at the expense of what we consider to be important. The next con is that these cheap controllers can sometimes be a little bit complicated, where companies that are officially licensed often hold your hand and make the experience as pain-free as possible. When it comes to open source, you often have to plug it into your computer, type in some magic words into a browser, enter numbers into your computer like 192.168.7.1 and just hope that that's not going to lead you into some situation where you're going to download a virus onto your computer. Obviously, it is safe because that's a local connection, but again, it's complicated to people who don't really understand what all that jargon means. Flexibility and customization is, of course, a massive plus, but a lot of people don't really want flexibility and customization. A lot of people want to buy a controller, read absolutely nothing, plug it into a console, and they just want to play the game and never think about it ever again. That should also be totally possible with these cheap controllers, but keep in mind, it's just less common because they are cheaper and often you get a little piece of paper that kind of explains what you're supposed to do, but doesn't always explain everything. The next con is console compatibility. Although sometimes you can plug it in and have no issues, there are some consoles where you will need authentication. And unfortunately, with open source software, they really can't afford to give you the authentication file. That starts to sound a little bit dodgy. Like, if the controller is compatible with PS5, why don't you just give me the file that makes it compatible with PS5? Well, it's because those authentication files aren't open source. They're owned by companies like Sony and Microsoft when they make their consoles. You might see that on the website, it does give you instructions on how to upload an authentication file that allows controllers like these to run on PS5, but it doesn't tell you where to get that authentication file, and it doesn't really explain why it can't be included. So for the time being, as far as I'm aware, this firmware is not breaking any laws, but if there was a situation where they were starting to make a certain amount of money, who knows, there could be some kind of legal situation where a company sues another company, or a company sues a large group of people trying to say that this firmware was encouraging people to illegitimately download the files that would give a controller the authentication required to work seamlessly on a console like PS5 or PS4. I haven't heard of any issues like this before, but do keep in mind that EVO, the biggest tournament in the world for fighting games, has been purchased and is co-owned by Sony. They haven't said anything about it yet, but the world's largest tournament officially running on PlayStation consoles and then allowing people to plug in controllers that might be using illegitimately sourced authentication files, I can imagine them cracking down on that in the future. Hopefully nothing will happen. Now, the last con I want to mention is brand and reputation. Now, you personally might be thinking, I don't really care if the company has a good reputation or not, I just want a cheap controller. And if that's the case, eat your heart out. Go and buy yourself a cheap controller. But one thing I have noticed after over a decade of reviewing controllers and other products is that sometimes companies just change their name and disappear. Now, if they completely disappear, who's going to fix your controller or honor your warranty or guarantee that is supposedly included with your controller? Now, I've seen this in various product categories, but what usually happens is a product is launched and then another company makes a product that looks exactly the same but has a different name. And we have no idea whether they're two different companies or the same company just operating under two different names. If this product has a bad reputation and it never gets fixed, or the company just never communicates properly, that company can just disappear and reappear somewhere else with a different name, and it's got a fresh new reputation. Now, for the people that remember, obviously they're going to be like, well, I'm not going to buy from that company, and obviously they're the same as that company that disappeared. But a lot of consumers have no idea. Not everyone is on social media all the time, not everyone is going to fighting game events and talking to other people in the community, so they just don't know. A large number of people just go on the internet, look at the reviews, and it says, okay, out of 10 reviews, 10 got 5 stars. That sounds great. What they don't know is that before they were a separate company, they had thousands of 1-star reviews and everybody hated them. I'm not saying for certain that I know that this is happening, but for example, with this controller that I have right here, you can see that it says HOT42, but the company that contacted me and asked me to review this controller never mentioned HOT42. They said it's a Borcham controller. So I actually have no idea what the official name of this controller is. What I do know is that I have a physical device in my hands. I know what it says on the controller itself, and I know the name that was sent to me via email. But this does open up all sorts of loopholes. All right, in summary, I just want to go through the main points. Basically, cheap is usually a good thing, and it's definitely going to make it easier for us as consumers and increases the accessibility and our ability to get into fighting games with as low a barrier of entry as possible. What I want you to take away from this video is that a cheap price doesn't guarantee that it's a bad controller. It also doesn't guarantee anything about the quality and making it a good controller. The same thing goes with the open source firmware in these controllers. There are pros, but there are also cons. And going along with that, being not officially licensed does give these controllers a little bit of flexibility, but then at the same time, there are cons and it makes them a little bit less convenient. And finally, with all these new unknown brand names, we have no idea whether they're going to be in it for the long haul or whether they're going to disappear and not honor their warranties and guarantees. Who knows? So hopefully this video has helped you make a decision. It may even have confused you a little bit, but on the plus side, even if there are a huge number of cons to the controller you're looking at, they're usually so cheap that you could make that mistake over and over and over and over and over again and still have money left over. That means buying these cheap controllers is incredibly low risk, but potentially very high return. Now that's a fighting game. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out this video next to begin your journey into the world of controllers. I've been NihongoGamer. I'll see you real soon.